In 1724, publishing his Gemme Antiquae Celate, Philip von Stosch started the fashion for ancient sign gems. This collection of gems laid the foundations for a modern history of glyptics, arranged into a sequence of individual artistic personalities. But an equivalent art history of glyptics did exist also in classical antiquity. Can we find a sensibility towards gem engravers and their masterpieces analogous to that towards painters and sculptors? While Greek and Roman literature praised dozens of painters and sculptors, we are able to draw from written sources the names of only 8 or 9 artists, mainly from Posidippus' epigrams on gems and from Pliny's Natural History, Book 37. The name and profession of Menesarchos of Samos have been recorded only because he was the father of the philosopher Pythagoras. The multi-skilled Theodoros of Samos engraved Polycrates' seal. According to Pliny, the acme of glyptics coincides with Alexander's engraver, Pyrgotelis. As I have pointed out in my previous talk, Pliny states that Alexander only allowed the portrait of him to be depicted by the painter Apelles and the sculptor Lysippus, with whom Pyrgotelis is associated only by Pliny and Apuleius. According to Pliny, Pyrgotelis engraved Alexander's portraits on emeralds, but he doesn't describe any specific gem. Not even the portrait of Alexander chosen by Augustus as his second seal, after the Sphinx and before his last seal, a portrait engraved by Dioscurides. After Pyrgotelis, Pliny mentions two engravers apparently flourishing between Pyrgotelis and Dioscurides. Apollonides is otherwise unknown, while Cronius could be the same engraver praised in two of Posidippus' Lithica for a golden gem belonging to a courtesan, Nikonoi, and perhaps for a riton studded with gems or carved into a precious mineral. Posidippus also praises Timantes, who realized a starry lapislazuli for Demilos, who gave the gem to his lover Nicaea. Perhaps another Lithicon mentions a third engraver, Heros, but the text of the poem is too incomplete to be sure. Tryphon engraved the goddess of calm sea, Galene, on a blue berry. The chronology of the poet, Adeus, is not sure, but perhaps this engraver is the same who signed a cameo with Eros and Psyche, variably dated between the mid-1st century BC and the 1st century AD. The last engraver known from literary sources is again from Pliny's account. Dioscurides, who engraved Augustus' third seal, a faithful portrait of the emperor himself. His name is recorded also by Suetonius. So far for the literary sources. A very few names of artists, a rather small amount of masterpieces, and the only chronological sequence of engravers is that of Pliny's account, amounting to only 4 artists. A few sealing devices are briefly recorded by Pliny because of the fame of their owners. It seems very likely that Pliny couldn't rely on a well-established Hellenistic scholarship such as the treatises on painting and sculpture on which he based his description of the development of painting and sculpture in books 34, 35, and 36. It seems that Pliny was the first to put together a very brief chronological sequence of engravers, drawing information from different sources such as historical works and, perhaps, also poems such as Posidippus and other poets Litica. Pliny could have taken from poetical compositions the names of Cronus, Apollonides, and perhaps also Pergotelis with his emeralds, then adding Pergotelis to the duo Apellis Lysippus in his version of Alexander's edict. It seems indeed that in classical antiquity, glyptics and jewelry were almost never considered under the historical and diachronic perspective which would have been necessary for the development of a canon of artists and the finalization of a history of art equivalent to those of painting and sculpture. If we confront Posidippus' epigrams on gemstones with his poems on bronze sculptures, we see that while for sculpture Posidippus traces a sequence of famous masters of the past, regarding gems, the names of the artists are bound to those of the customer and receiver of their works, of their gems. The identity of the gem engraver seems mainly connected to specific occasions and owners, Polycrates, Alexander's, and Augustus Sees, Demilus, Nicaeas, and Niconois' gems. Unlike sculpture and painting, the art of gems has a present, but has no past. Anyway, alongside the very few engravers known from literary sources, today we know around 60 names of engravers who signed intaglios and cameos. Signatures on gems date from archaic Greece to late antiquity, with a peak between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, a time span which coincides with the works of the great Hellenistic masters settled in Rome. Engravers always sign as Greek artists, with Greek names or transliterating their name in Greek characters. As their colleagues, painters and sculptors, they were aware of the advantage of genuine or artificial ties with Greece. Literary sources don't record any workshop or dynasty of engravers, such as the many schools held by famous painters and sculptors like Pamphilos or Praxiteles. Anyway, today we do know two families' workshops of engravers, that of the engraver of Augustus, Dioscurides, with his pupils, sons Eutyches, Hyllos, and Herophilos, and that of Alexas, an engraver slightly older than Dioscurides, with his sons, pupils, Aulos and Quintus. A lot of intaglios and cameos bear the signature of Augustus' engraver. Alongside many modern works, there is a general consensus about 7 intaglios and 1 cameo. Both Herophilos and Eutyches signed only 1 gem each, stating their bond with Dioscurides. Hyllos stated his affiliation with Dioscurides on a cameo now in Berlin, while many other gems bear his name only. As for Alexas' workshop, only 1 cameo is signed by the founder. Quintus signs in Greek only 1 gem, while Aulos, alongside a cameo bearing his patronymic, signs many other gems with his name only. Perhaps the gems bearing the name of the master father of the engraver were realized at the beginning of his career. Collected together, the artists associated with Dioscurides' workshop signed at least 22 gems. Those of Alexas' workshop, 11. And if we confront the number of gems signed by other artists, we find a connection between the manifestation of artistic and familiar bonds and the importance recognized by the artist to his signature. And it seems not incidental that the last of the only two signatures in which the artist declares his ethnicity belongs to a member of one of the only two workshops known to us. 5 centuries after the Examenos of Chios, it is Dioscurides' son Eutyches who declares that he is from Aegaea. Aulos, Quintus, Eutyches, Herophilos, and Milos found it advantageous to declare their artistic and perhaps also familiar affiliation with a great master. And thanks to their signatures, they gave consistency to a diachronic perspective, even if it doesn't exceed the span of one generation. It also seems quite significant that, to our knowledge, nobody records the names of Alexander's engraver, and, with the exception of his 3 sons, of Augustus' engraver. Why? As I have pointed out in my previous talk, some engravers sign their gems with the names of celebrated painters and sculptors. Unlike sculptors and painters, whose names and achievements were also the subject of a flourishing scholarship, gem engravers could only rely on their own works and signatures. Beyond Posidippus and Pliny, the only evidence about the reception of glyptic masters and their works in classical antiquity comes from a text and a context quite unexpected. According to the Historia Augusta, Elagabalus wore engraved gemstones on his shoes. His behavior made people laugh, because this way it was impossible to admire the sculpture made by the nobiles artifices of glyptics. In Elagabalus' time, the art of engraving was facing a slow decline. A few high-quality intaglios among a plethora of mass-produced seals, and a very few signed gems with respect to the age of Alexas and Dioscurides' workshops. But even in the 3rd century AD, Elagabalus' detractors were able to admire the works of the great masters of glyptics. These gemstones were probably part of the collection of intaglios and cameos handed down from emperor to emperor, until the irreverent use made by Elagabalus. If the artists of these carvings could be still recognized as great masters of glyptics, should we therefore assume that their identities were otherwise known to Elagabalus' contemporaries? Probably not. As previously observed, literary sources suggest that not even Alexander's and Augustus' engravers received a lasting attention. It seems unlikely that at the beginning of the 3rd century AD, many have known by name engravers whose acme dated back to decades or centuries earlier. And if it was not a long-established historical artistic tradition that justified the nobilitas of these artifices, I think that it was the very act of signing and the manifest will of the artist to make eternal their identity, and their identity as Greek artists, to make those artifices nobiles for Elagabalus' detractors. Thank you very much for your attention.
Nochmals Dank an die erste Referentin. Und nun kommen wir zu dem zweiten Vortrag von 2 Kollegen aus Spanien, Alfredo Encuentra Ortega and Carolina Naya Franco, both working at the University of Zaragoza, and their combined expertise will now analyze the topic from ampullae to onyxes, luxury gemstones, unguentaria in Roman literature. So please begin.
Hello all, This is Alfredo Encuentra from Spain. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving us a chance of presenting our research. This contribution is part of the research project Carolina and I share on luxury art objects. Carolina is analyzing Renaissance jewelry and perfume flasks called coma, and my point of research is the philological analysis of Roman gemstone vessels, where terminology proves fundamental to match archaeological finds with the original names. Results are forthcoming in 2 papers dealing with crystallina, diatreta, thoriumata, and the techniques and tools wherewith these different kinds of vessels were fashioned. This is also the case with unguent flasks or vials, some of which were carved from gemstones. For bathing, balnea, and perfumes, unguenta, were deemed status makers in ancient Rome and were linked to public consumption of luxury goods. As a matter of fact, bathing and anointing were not genuine Roman customs, but imported from the Hellenistic East. In austere Republican times, they were disregarded as tokens of lavishness. After the conquest of Alexandria, however, the Augustan program made those small luxuries popular, and bathhouses, together with their complements, old flasks, stragios, towels, etc., became usual commodities. As regards perfumes, Roman archaic comedy associated them with debauched adolescentes, Roman youths, indulging in banquets and courtesans. Scortari, potare, unguenta olere, says Terentius. But in the Hellenized Rome of the early Principate, perfumes were essential at the end of drinking parties, the commissationes, where guests were given garlands and unguents before leaving. The best ones, as that Catullus offered to his friend Fabulus, were expensive imports, like Syrian malobathrum or Assyrian amomum. To add on their social value, they were also kept in luxury materials. The perfumes by the famous Cosmos could not have such containers. This is a brief picture that literary sources draw, especially those dating from the Augustan and the Flavian era. The question arises then as to whether these luxury flasks received a specific name. This question is as urgent as in the case of small containers in general, which are vaguely termed unguentaria. Specialists are uncertain about their real names and classify them either by their standard shape, amphoriscos, ampulla, conchiglia, etc., or by their would-be purpose, unguentaria, balsamaria, lacrimaria, etc. Moreover, in ancient Romans had a different conception and terminology on materials, which many times differs from ours, even if the signifiers are identical. Therefore, our aim in this paper is twofold. On the one hand, we'll attempt to make a contextual analysis of perfume flasks as regards shape, material, and purpose. On the other, we will focus on gemstone versions, rock crystal, agate, etc., which best embody the values attached to Roman luxury. Ancient sources refer to unguent containers with 4 names: ampulla, alabastron, onyx, and concha. The first 3 seem to be synonymous, since Marshall introduces Cosmian perfumes either as ampulla cosmiana, alabastra cosmi, or onyx cosmi. Yet, each of them show peculiar nuances. The most generic term is ampulla. Being a Latin diminutive from amphora, its shape should be deemed similar. However, we deduce from Pliny, who names a type of pear after an ampulla, that Roman ampullae were mainly piriform or bulbous, not fusiform. Material did not specify its meaning, since ampullae could be wrought in different materials, such as metal, especially in those used at public baths, glass, ampullae vitreae, terracotta, or expensive gemstones. Their purpose neither did, for they commonly held bath oil, ampulla olearia, etc. Ampullae were even used as potoria in the Flavian era. Suetonius remarks that Domitian at his private cena used to have a small drink from an ampulla. Given Domitian's penchant for luxury, especially crystallina, theirs may be carved from gemstones. In this sense, Marshall joyfully toys with the double purpose of the item when describing an ampulla potoria in 110. He says, a little bottle for drinking. Luxury lover, you may drink from these gemstones in gemma vivas that keeps the names of cosmos if you thirst for perfumes. The pan is clear. Marshall spoofs those who, after the emperor, turned former unguent flasks into wine potoria. As deduced, ampulla was the general term for small containers, this particular instance pointing to a gemstones. A set found in Cadiz in 1997 contains 9 of these ampullae, likely used for perfumes. All but one are rock crystal, deemed the most valuable material on Earth in Pliny's time. A remaining link around the armlet of the first amphoriscos left, as you can see, suggests that unguent flasks were suspended from chains or threads or cords, etc. This way, the risk of casually dropping them was avoided. Indentation on arms in figure 4 and damaged bottlenecks, also in figure 4, you can see, right and left, may be explained that way. An image of a delicatus page shows a tiny flask hanging from his left hand, as you can see. And this custom endured, and Renaissance ladies wore them as penchant on their garments, as can be seen from instance and jewelry draft. You have a picture, a portrait. The detail is clearly to be seen, an ampulla and a draft on the right. Unlike general ampullae, alabastron was strongly linked to unguents. Pliny declared that perfumes were best kept in alabastra. Although shape and material are confused in the modern term alabaster, Pliny distinguishes the elongated shape of alabastra, a special kind of vessel, from the stone called alabastrites or alabastris, the material these traditional Egyptian containers were usually made of. This stone combined bands of white and other colors. Its name and substance derived from the quarries near the Egyptian city called Alabastron. However, Pliny made apart, Roman literary sources ignore alabastrites and just cite alabastra as perfume containers. Latin use continued Alexandrian instances focusing on shape and banquet lavishness as perceived in the golden alabastron Theocritus cites in the song of the Argive woman's daughter, Chryseia alabastra, he says. So Petronian Trimalchio stunned his guests with a disc descending from the ceiling with a row of pendant perfume alabastra, and Marshall adduces Cosmi alabastra among the comparanda to his favorite kisses. The variegated set in figure 1 includes a rock crystal alabastrum on your left, and a cameo agate alabastron is also displayed in figure 4.3. This on your right, you have the shape of these containers and alabastron. Albeit being formally alabastra, these instances do not fit the material we call alabastra, which Roman really knew and imported, but reserved for other kind of containers. Were these containers then onyxes? Maybe. When describing onyx, Pliny informs that some also call this stone alabaster. Physical properties. In fact, onyx is cited among colored stone combined on floors and walls. It was also a streaked or banded material, and as regards etymology, onyx points to a nail-like stone. Onyx, nail. Plums were named after half shades of purple. In this sense, Propertius adds an interesting detail by alluding to a Mureus onyx. Urinum alluded by boiling them in honey caramel. So figure 4.1 on your left aptly fits the maculosa mura the pretender Eros admires in the septa but cannot afford in martial epigram 1080. The magnificent instances in figures 4.2 and 4.3, both cameo, may also figure among colored onyxes. Their iconography also fits the erotic and convivial atmosphere of Roman elegy. So, in the Catullin rendition of the Lock of Berenike, a famous poem by Callimachus, the goddess advises chaste brides to make her libation from their onyxes before joining their husbands. And Propertius encourages his mistress to anoint with saffron perfume while celebrating her birthday party. Inter pocula nox currat et crocino naris murreus ungat onyx. These aspects of elegy are parodied by Martial. So, in epigram 1149, Martial targets Phyllis, who abuses of Martial's hospitality and empties his perfume bottle. And epigram 794 derided stinky Papillus, who turns delicate unguent into pestilent garum on smelling it. Onyxes are also introduced in elegiac burial anointments, and the funerary urn of a poor delicatus was also made from an onyx. The most easily identifiable terms are concha and murex, being either natural shells or shell-shaped containers. In the recently discovered lithica, Posidippus describes a Persian mother of pearl bearing Aegaea engraved on its cavity. Luxury versions of such items were made in gold, silver, rock crystal, and agate. Rock crystal, small shells, are contained in this set from Cadiz. Conchae may keep dense or solid cosmetics, opus balsamum, for instance, but texts also refer to large containers of perfumes to be divided among guests. So Horace encourages his friend Pompeius to pour unguents from capacious shells, and Martial criticizes Zoilus for giving expensive cosmium from ampullae to his slaves, but dividing a cheap capillare among freemen from a golden murex. Details on the size and appearance of these conchae are provided by Juvenal, who exemplifies the dangers of imported luxury in Roman women attending drinking parties after midnight. In the drunkenness, he says, they mistake the containers for wine and perfumes. They pour expensive wine over unguents and drink from shells. Bibitur concha, says Juvenal. Gemstones vessels of the type in figures 5.1 and 5.2, later reused as goblets in Renaissance, may well be respectively termed murex and concha. We can conclude that Roman focused on size and appearance to designate unguent flasks rather than on material or shape. Thus, they call ampulla any kind of small container and prefer the Greek words alabastron and onyx when they wanted to add charm and evoke the sensual and refined Hellenistic customs, or they simply pointed to expensive versions. However, the term onyx, sometimes identified and confused with marble and alabaster because of its traits, may surely allude to a colored gemstone. In fact, most extant instances point to banded agates or any kind of microcrystalline silica. The sole exceptions are murex and concha, whose meaning is determined by shape and purpose. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you and your colleague for your presentation. I hope the connection was a bit better for everybody else than for me. For me, it was sometimes a bit difficult to follow, but in any case, thank you very much. And now we are coming to the third topic of Sven Günther and his wife Elisabeth Günther. Meine herzlichen Grüße an die beiden, die ich sehr gut kenne. And now they will present, they are experts in two different scientific disciplines in ancient history and archaeology. And I presume it's also a big topic, more than a legal framework. Gemma in Roman law, a new perspective on Roman imperial society. That is promising. Thank you.
Welcome to our paper, Gems in Roman Law. Function, materiality, value. This trinity we argue to be the essence of Roman legal regulations and considerations regarding gems. Yet, this is not somehow surprising, given that these three categories were not only legal perspectives on gems, but were deeply rooted in political, social, economic, cultural, and religious discourses and practices of not only Roman times. This we see, of course, in the many different talks during our conference days, but becomes also instantly clear when one has a look at the lemma structure of the article gemma in the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae. Besides the meaning of eye or gem on a plant, oculus arboris, the main meaning is not only restricted to a precious stone, lapidus pretiosus, but comprises in particular whom or what they ornate, where they come from, how and in which way they are treated by artisans, what things are made of these precious stones, and in which way they figuratively indicate positively or negatively judged ornaments, either with regard to objects or persons. That this, albeit modern classification, is nevertheless based on ancient testimonies, basically encompassing our triad of gems in Roman law, postulated above, function, materiality, value, is a good sign, since it shows that Roman law, which is often considered to form a world of its own, an autopoietic system in the words of the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, has arguably some links, interrelations, and entanglements to and with the respective, namely the Roman society. Although historians, archaeologists, and philologists often and regrettably stay away from the alleged complexity of legal sources and language. The aim of our talk is thus clear. We ask, to what extent do legal sources contribute to our understanding of the roles gems played in Roman law and society, mainly in the late Republic and imperial period, where the majority of our sources come from. For this, we have to think about why, how, and in which context gems became objects of Roman law, and can therefrom try to answer the questions that what these legal texts tell us about the Roman society, their practices and discourses. For this, we will first analyze sealing regulations and practices, since these functions are frequently present in our sources, legal and non-legal ones. Second, we will have a look at the materiality of gems and how this is treated in Roman law. Third, we will turn our attention to moral discourses linked to gems within the legal framework and will try to show the degree of this aspect gaining ground therein. We will sum up with few ideas about how Roman law and society were entangled. We start with a text that seems not to be a legal one, at least at first sight. It is a fictitious discussion taking place at a dinner party, a symposium, during the Saturnalia, the Roman festival of the god Saturn from 17 to 23rd December, written by the early 5th century author Macrobius Ambrosius Theodosius. Dealing with different topics and questions, in the 7th book, the characters also talk about the origin of wearing a ring on the left hand and the fourth finger. After getting known to the Egyptian custom, the participant Caecina Albinus enters the discourse by quoting the Augustan Tiberian jurist and strong supporter of the imperial regime, Gaius Ateius Capito, with his deep knowledge of pontifical law. Through Capito's authority, it is related that the function of a ring, namely to serve as a sealing device, was the sole function in older, and this means here better times, and only allowed for free men who could testify by sealing and thus had one single ring only, which carried a sculptura, that is, a distinctive device to make the sealing imprint unique. by evoking features of the not only in Augustan and Tiberian times emerging luxury discourse, for instance, non ornatus sed signandi causa, use annulorum only for free men, not for slaves, material value is irrelevant. He then contrasts this old practice with the contemporary one, where the usus luxuriantis aetatis brought up the habit to let the distinctive sealed feature being engraved in gemmis prediosis. Whence not only a competition of having the most precious gems and consequently a rise of prices occurred, but also wearing practices changed. While before the wearing position did not matter, nowadays the protection of the ring with the precious stone became an issue. Hence, the left hand being more idle and the forefinger being best protected became the standard. Apart from the moral tone, it is immediately evident that the three proposed key categories of gems in Roman law, function, materiality, value, play the key role to understand this episode. The functional aspect, here gems serving as sealing devices in sealing practices, is often treated in our sources. The imprint of a uniquely cut stone could serve as an individual fraud-resistant signature, giving authority to written documents. For this, it was necessary that the owner of the seal recognized it as his own, as two passages illustrate. According to the Justinian Digest, it was strictly forbidden to give false testimony and neglect one's own seal. This underlines not only the high meaning of a seal as the individual signature of a person and its legally binding function, but also illustrates that not the images shown on the seal were important, but it was their unique design that could be recognized not only by the owner, but also by witnesses. In case of legal documents like certificates, contracts, testaments, the text was written inside and outside of the document. To read the inner text was only possible if one broke the 7 seals of the witnesses. This guaranteed the authenticity of the document. In addition, seals were used in written correspondence to authorize the letter. Such a case describes Cicero in his 3rd Catilinarian speech to the Roman people. 3 persons, Cethegus, Statilius, and Lentulus, acknowledge their handwriting and seal in a letter, seemingly following a standard procedure which flawlessly proves their and the Alloproges involvement in the Catilinarian conspiracy. In this case, the seal serves as a piece of evidence and illustrates its high authenticity. Moreover, the seal of Lentulus allegedly showed the portrait of his grandfather, an illustrious and famous man, and Cicero uses this fact to point out the moral implications of Lentulus' behavior, saying that the memory of his ancestor should have prevented him from writing and sealing such a letter. Although the image on the gemstone did not have any impact on the authenticity of the seal, it was obviously of high personal meaning, and, like in this case, it did not only refer to and shed light on a single person, but to and on the whole family of the seal's owner, thus idealizing its socio-political function of aligning the noble families with the fate of the res publica and intensifying its moral and intrinsic value, all being now at stake and endangered, at least in the view of Cicero. The material aspect of gems is of particular interest in the Justinian Digest, as it touches on different legal problems that the Roman jurists had to reflect on and solve by uttering their legal opinion. One important question concerned the compensation for damages resulting from artisans' treatment of a gem in respect of including it, for instance, in a ring, or engraving it with a motive. Basically, this fell under the actio locati conducti, the lessee and lessor suit, since typically the gem was transferred by its owner to an artisan via a service contract. Whence both sides could mutually sue claims, for instance, for wage payments or proper performing of duties. Regarding damages on gems, the important points were whether the damage occurred due to the lack of skill on the side of the artisan, then he was liable, or was caused by the defect of the material, the gem itself. However, for the latter, which was already a well-established rule, the Severan jurist Ulpian adds the differentiation whether the artisan knew about the risk of a defective gem and assumed this risk. Then he could be held liable even though the defect of the material and not his skill caused the damage to the gem. If a gem had been included in a ring, for instance, but actually belonged to another party than the one owning the ring, the legal question of how to recover the gem arose. Normal action for reivindicatio was not possible, since this in rem actio demanded that the full object belonged to the one suing. Yet the gem was only part of the ring, and not the principal part, but only the accessory one, and thus did not have an own object quality when united with the leading principal object. Hence, the personal actio ad exhibendum for producing the object, that is, the ring in our case, at the place where the action was tried, applied. The purpose was for separating the things that had been joined together without agreement. Of course, without destroying the other, that means the principal thing. If this was not possible due to physical or technical reasons, a title to compensation arose. In the case of a legacy, several questions could arise. For instance, whether a bequeathed table crown included the gems attached to it. Then the same concept like in actio ad exhibendum, namely the accessory follows the principle applied. According to a passage in the digest, one must differentiate between the principal object, the piece of jewelry, and the ornament, ornamentum. In most cases, gems were considered to be accessories, inserted, for instance, into drinking cups, gold or silver plates, or table crowns, which are the examples mentioned in the whole paragraph. The same rule applies to gems set in rings, and gemmae are defined as translucent stones, emeralds, chrysolites, and amethysts, and are not identical with precious stones such as obsidian. One exception is in the case that gems are set in gold in order to preserve them. Then the gold is accessory to the stone. A further passage informs us that gems, precious stones, pearls, or jewels, when they are still rough, that is, have not been artificially treated, are not to be considered as ornaments, except the testator explicitly wished otherwise and intended them to be used as ornaments. The use of gems as ornaments even serves as a model to define further uses and forms of jewelry. Digest 7.128 concerning usufruct issues states that old silver and gold coins can be bequeathed and given as usufruct if they are used pro gemmis, that is, instead of gems. It seems that since such coins could not be used as legal currency anymore and thus could not be consumed, they were able to count among real usufruct. The phrase pro gemmis illustrates their function as ornament of jewelry and shows that the purpose of gems as ornaments somehow was proverbial, so that the sense of the passage could easily be grasped by the reader. The ornamental character of gems also posed the question of what is regarded as necessary and what as luxury. In an undated imperial rescript of the Emperor Hadrian to Aquilius Bradua, perhaps Marcus Atilius Metilius Bradua, at this time probably a governor of an albeit unknown province, the emperor distinguishes first between clothing, panicularia, which belong to a man brought to prison, and bona damnatorum, goods of the convicted. Smaller goods like clothing, small sums of money, or light rings not exceeding the value of 5 auri were counted among panicularia, while high-value rings or gems did not. The jurist Ulpian explains further that these panicularia became spolia when the imprisoned person wore them at the execution. Yet it was ordered that these spolia should not be claimed and taken by the ones executing the prisoner, but reasonably used by the governors for public purposes. A last regulation brings us to late antique regulations of actresses' clothing. Under the title Des Cainicis, men and women of the stage, In the 15th book of the Codex Theodosianus, where quite some regulations of the lives of performers are laid down, we find also a prohibition for mimae to wear expensive gems or silk clothing. Issued by the emperors Theodosius, Arcadius, and Honorius on the 21st September of the year 393, we can view this imperial constitution as an attempt to limit the luxury and especially showing off of such luxurious objects by a lower social group that often found rich sponsors among the wealthy elite. On the other hand, the permission to wear seemingly expensive clothing for their performance shows that the line between belonging to this social group and the elite, who did not underlie such restrictions, was small, but visible for those who carefully looked at such details of social distinguishment. To sum up, gems in Roman law mirror some of the important legal discourses of the Roman imperial period. Among and along the categories function, material, and value, we hope to have shown that gems were an integral part of the social, economic, and sometimes political and moral discourses, as well as practices of the Romans, arguably very often and mainly a rather wealthy class of persons who could afford and talk about them. While moral and luxury discourses, which we frequently find in literary sources, played only a smaller role in the legal considerations, it were rather practical issues, for instance related to artisanry, inheritance, and classification, that troubled not only the jurists, and they resulted from the specific functions and material aspect of gems. As high value and overall distinct objects, they prominently appear in legal regulations and thus obviously mattered. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sven, for this talk. And I must confess, it was also very interesting for me myself, looking at the Roman society under this aspect. But since we don't have much time, we have immediately to go to the next talk, presented by Giovanna Di Giacomo. I must say, I met our next speaker, Giovanna Di Giacomo, when she submitted a paper for our ZPE, and especially about the topic about these objects. And I'm now curious to see or to hear what she will tell us about the ars gemmaria in Rome. So please, Signora.
Good morning. Fonti letterarie archeologiche offrono molte informazioni sui luoghi di approvvigionamento e sulle principali, sui luoghi di approvvigionamento e sulle principali vie marittime battute dalle gemme per arrivare a Roma dalle regioni orientali. Sempre queste fonti restituiscono un ampio campionario di manufatti realizzati con le gemme, grazie al quale desumiamo che i gemmari, gli artigiani specializzati nel taglio, nella politura e nell'incisione dei minerali preziosi o semipreziosi, producevano e vendevano al dettaglio soprattutto semilavorati, ovvero gemme sciolte da castone, sia lisce sia decorate in taglio a cammeo, che poi erano sospese o incastonate da altri artigiani su anelli, fibule, collane, bracciali, orecchini, vasi potori e superbi apparati decorativi. Non mancavano tuttavia quei gemmari che, operando anche nell'ultimo anello della filiera produttiva, lavoravano e commerciavano anche prodotti finiti, come vivaci monili composti di grani e i vasi di piccolo taglio, a uso soprattutto potorio, con pareti lisce o decorate in rilievo, tra i quali particolarmente ricercati e costosi erano i fragili cristallina e murrina, scavati rispettivamente nel cristallo di rocca e nella fluorite. Sono invece i documenti epigrafici a preservare i nomi, i rapporti personali e i luoghi dell'attività di questi artigiani che avevano posto la loro arte al servizio del lusso dell'elite ai vertici della società romana. Conosciamo a Roma 12 gemmari che hanno lasciato testimonianza di sé, ai quali si aggiunge la realtà collettiva di un collegio. Le loro iscrizioni, soprattutto sepolcrali, si distribuiscono in un arco cronologico compreso dalla seconda metà del secondo secolo a.C. e la metà del secondo secolo d.C. La componente sociale più rappresentata è quella libertina. La realtà economica è quella di un mondo di artigiani e rivenditori al dettaglio che esercitavano la propria attività in botteghe situate in determinati quartieri di Roma. A giudicare da un esame combinato delle fonti epigrafiche, archeologiche e letterarie, i luoghi riservati nel corso del tempo all'ars gemmaria furono l'area dell'Acus Iuturne nel faro romano, il tratto orientale della Via Sacra, i Septa Iulia in Campo Marzio e l'area capitolina. A Roma la fioritura dell'ars gemmaria sembra risalire ai tempi dell'ittoria di Lucio Emilio Paolo su Perseo, quando tra la classe dirigente erano da tempo adusi a far incastonare gemme sculpte sugli anuli signatori, fu esibita in trionfo una pesante fiala in oro, commissionata per l'occasione dallo stesso trionfatore, nelle quali le gemme incluse non avevano più una destinazione sigillare e quindi utilitaria, ma puramente ornamentale. Solo qualche decennio più tardi, infatti, i magistri di un collegio che riuniva tra gli altri anche i gemmari curarono la dedica di un monumento cilindrico con fregio dorico a una divinità ignota. Le officine glittiche dei primi artefici attivi sulla piazza di Roma andranno pertanto localizzate non lontano dal luogo di rinvenimento di questo donario, nel settore orientale del faro romano, forse lungo il percorso della via sacra. Nello stesso orizzonte cronologico, la presenza di gemmari ai margini dell'area forense è confermata dalla scoperta, all'interno di alcune botteghe situate nell'area dell'Acus Iuturne, di numerose gemme in pasta vitrea, sia lisce sia decorate in taglio, che riflettendo la nascita di una produzione in serie con funzione ornamentale, destinata a una clientela non certo facoltosa, testimoniano come tutti i concittadini di Lucio Emilio Paolo avessero ormai imparato non solo ad ammirare, ma anche a desiderare l'opulenza straniera. A trasformare la passione glittica dei romani in una vera e propria mania fu tuttavia lo scenografico trionfo mitridatico di Pompeo Magno, in occasione del quale sfilarono due minerali preziosi, ricoperti da vasi in oro incrostati di gemme, vasi potori scavati nella murra e la collezione di plures gemme sottratta allo sconfitto re del Ponto. Sulla scia di questa cerimonia, che a detta di Plinio ad gemmas mores inclinavit, i gemmari e gli altri artefici di preziosi iniziarono progressivamente a trasformarlo nel luogo deputato al commercio del lusso. Nel corso del III-IV del I secolo a.C., grazie al benestare delle rispettive famiglie legate da interessi economici e forse tra loro apparentate, gestirono congiuntamente una bottega de Sacravia ben 5 gemmari, i 2 colliberti Babbia Asia e Gaius Babius Regillus e i 3 colliberti, i quinti Plozzi, Nicefor, Anteros e Felix. In età augustea, al banco dei babbi e dei plozzi, era già subentrato quello del liberto Lucius Salvius Temella, un gemmarius di probabile origine orientale, che forse è da relazionare agli altri albi attivi a Roma nella stessa epoca, l'Aurarius Publius Albius Apollonius, doratore con bottega nel vicino Velabro, e il Vascularius Aulus Albius Anubio, e questo anche in ragione della possibile interdipendenza delle loro arti, ben rappresentata da manufatti come l'Hydreum Gemmis Exornatum et Auratum, ricordato in un'iscrizione di Nomentum. Contemporaneo di Temella è anche l'unico gemmarius di condizione servile noto a Roma, Amtus, che in quanto tale aveva svolto la propria attività in ambito privato, al servizio di una famiglia di prestigio. Leggermente successivo nel tempo è Lucius Utedius Hermias, che nel suo epitaffio si qualifica Gemmarius Sculptor, evidentemente per porre in rilievo che era in grado di seguire l'intero ciclo produttivo delle pietre preziose, dal taglio fino alla scultura, distinguendo i suoi prodotti da quelli ordinari degli altri gemmari, che sulla piazza di Roma probabilmente trattavano soprattutto gemme lisce. Arriviamo alla seconda metà del I secolo con il gemmarius Marcus Lollius Alexander, proprietario sulla via Appia di un sepolcro, la cui tipologia, un edes cum suo ipogeo, riflette le possibilità economiche che l'ars gemmaria poteva assicurare a quanti la praticavano, soprattutto in un'epoca in cui si era diffusa la moda di portare una gemma su ciascun dito, di bere vino da gemmata potoria e di voler calpestare solo pietre preziose. Il ramo gentilizio di Alexander richiama alla mente quello dei marcilolli senatori e suggerisce la possibilità che la sua attività si fosse svolta all'ombra del patronato di questa famiglia, che in età augustea aveva intessuto rapporti con l'Oriente e in particolare con i principali referenti o mediatori del commercio di pietre preziose. A questo proposito basterà ricordare che Plinio, descrivendo la parure sfoggiata dall'oglia paolina, aggiunge che gli smeraldi che la componevano non erano stati acquistati dalla donna, né erano doni del marito Caligola, bensì avite opes, ricchezze di cui il nonno, il consolare Marco Lollio, aveva spogliato le regioni orientali. Il sospetto che i gemmari operassero all'ombra di personalità di alto rilievo sembra d'altra parte confortato dal fatto che queste attività non solo richiedevano capitali da investire nell'acquisto dei minerali preziosi, ma assicuravano considerevoli profitti, di cui il ceto dirigente, amante del lusso, era ben più che consapevole. Sempre Plinio, del resto, elencando le res di maximum prezium ai suoi tempi, assegna il primo posto al cristallo di rocca tra quelli raccolti sulla superficie terrestre, al diamante, alla murra, agli smeraldi e alle altre gemme tra quelli estratti dal sottosuolo, aggiungendo in calce che l'oro e l'argento, per cui i mortali erano disposti a fare follie, occupavano appena il 10° e 20° posto nella scala dei valori. Ritorniamo lungo la via sacra con i decimi Faustus e Fortunatus, due probabili colliberti che almeno fino all'età Flavia gestirono sulla strada un laboratorio specializzato nella produzione e nella vendita di cave e gemme, ovvero vasi di piccolo taglio scavati nei minerali preziosi, così come sembra indiziare l'inedita qualifica di cavatores. A questa interpretazione indirizza la circostanza che quando il verbo cavare è riferito all'ars gemmaria rinvia alla produzione vascolare e in particolare descrive il momento centrale del ciclo di lavorazione dei vasi potori, quello in cui la gemma, già ridotta tramite sbozzatura nella forma e nelle dimensioni prossime a quelle del futuro manufatto, era sagomata con lo scavo della vasca. D'altra parte, proprio in età Flavia, si moltiplicano nella letteratura i riferimenti ai vascula scavati nelle pietre preziose, che riflettendo una crescita della domanda sul mercato, ben possono giustificare la fioritura di taberne dedite in via esclusiva alla loro produzione. A partire dall'età domizianea, i Septa Iulia in Campo Marzio ereditarono la vocazione della via sacra, fino ad assurgere al luogo in cui laurea Roma suas opes vexat. Dopo l'incendio che aveva devastato l'area e le opere di restauro promosse da Domiziano, i Septa furono infatti rifunzionalizzati per accogliere rivendite di preziosi. Descrivendo le manie dei contemporanei, Marziale e Giovenale hanno redatto un vero e proprio catalogo dei prodotti che era possibile acquistare, almeno fino all'età adrianea, nelle candide case montate sotto i portici della piazza. Incontriamo così i corinziari che vendevano oggetti forgiati nel bronzo corinzio, una lega che miscelava rame, stagno, oro e argento. Gli argentari vasculari, che trattavano anche argenterie cesellate di antiquariato, tra cui i vetere scalati e i pocula nobilitati dalla mano di mentore, o piuttosto loro falsificazioni. Gli aurifices, che smerciavano aurea vascula incrostati di smeraldi, insieme a tintinnanti crotalia a duplice pendente con perle, e infine i nostri gemmari, che vendevano sardoniche, diaspri, diamanti e vasi scavati nella murra e nel cristallo di rocca. Sotto i portici dei Septa, oppure tra le ultime botteghe attive lungo la via sacra, sarà forse da localizzare anche il banco del Gemmarius Titus Rubrius, che operò tra la fine del I e la prima metà del II secolo. Le limitate occorrenze dei Titi Rubri, rappresentati a Roma dai Titi Rubri senatori e da altri 3 individui riconducibili nell'orbita della loro clientela, rendono plausibile supporre che anche per il nostro artigiano un legame con questa famiglia di rango. Dopo un lungo silenzio, ritroviamo un accenno all'ars gemmaria nell'affresco epistolare dedicato da Sidonio Apollinare all'area capitolina, il grande piazzale intorno al Tempio di Giove, che nella seconda metà del V era stato declassato a svolgere un'inedita funzione voluttuaria. I banchi intorno ai quali l'autore descrive l'aggirarsi ora interessato, ora sprezzante dell'amico Arvando, sono individuati con i manufatti rappresentativi delle singole arti. I serica per i vestiari, i preziosa involucra di monete per i trapezziti e banchieri e infine le mostre di gemme per i gemmari. E all'ombra di questo paesaggio crepuscolare, popolato di simulacri e templi lasciati all'incuria e alla voracità del tempo, che si consuma l'ultimo riferimento alla produzione e al commercio di preziosi in Roma. Thank you very much for your attention.
Of these conferences.
Oh, absolutely. I'll be brave. I have a question for Sven Günther about the glass gems. What do you do when you suddenly get the reproduction of exactly the same seal and it's the same size? Does that have implications for the law? Do you think it's only certain people who would have a gem like this? That it would be more, the function would definitely be luxury or display rather than something official.
Yeah, That's a very good question. May I answer from the legal point of view, and then maybe my wife from the archaeological point of view? From the legal point of view, unfortunately, we do not have any trace of such a really difficult question in our sources. I think mainly since such things did not occur, or they were not considered to somehow violate the document, since normally you have several forms of approval. I mean, you can, of course, testify your own seal, but on the other hand, of course, also the witnesses can testify it, and so there are several steps in between. So from the legal point of view, unfortunately, there is no trace of such difficult question. But from the archaeological point of view,
yeah, it's also difficult to answer. Yeah, it's a fascinating question. So I can just think of three possibilities. So the first possibility is that this gem was not used as the official seal, so it did not have this purpose for the person, and then maybe it was not a big problem if there was such a similarity. The second is within the huge Roman Empire, maybe there could exist several seals that were somehow very nearly identical, but did not exist so close to each other that it became a problem. But this would then not be maybe the very highest elite level who had networks in the whole empire, but maybe of another status, lower. The third possible answer could be there is a difference, but we cannot really detect it. So it is handmade. So it is, of course, individual. So there is no second gem that can look exactly the same way. The question is whether we can distinguish it, and whether in ancient times it was possible to distinguish them. But I guess that these three possibilities are clear to you, so I could not really provide you an answer from the legal framework. It is just like Sven said, we don't find any case where this was discussed somehow.
Yes, but I think very important is this aspect of that all these legal issues are embedded into the society. So you have several people linked as groups and networks to the person sealing, and I think this is mainly the issue that has to be considered. And if it's going outside that spheres, then in fact it doesn't really matter whether that's very similar or not. It would only be an issue if it's within the same social circle, and then other links might overcome this problem.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Any other question?
Yeah, I would like to say that the glass gems inlaid with gold, they are not made for any sealing, and therefore we should probably think that also other glass gems would have never been for sealing. They were for giving them to the clienteles, to the people who were dependent from a bigger figure, and we should not make this our problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for this additional information. I also think we really have to distinguish gems that were cut in stones, individually cut stones, and reproductions and other kinds of products. Yeah, thank you very much. You're a great expert in this field. Yeah, so thank you very much for adding this information.
Yeah. Any other questions? If not, I would like to ask Signora Di Giacomo once more about, we had just this discussion about that, how secure are the connections you have shown between individual gemmarii and elite families, senatorial or equestrian families? could you give us an answer about the security? Because these are conclusions, of course, you know.
Yes, and it's only an hypothesis. Because it's possible that the artificers and negotiantes of precious, generally of libertine condition, were related to family of great social prestige because they needed money to start the business and also to buy the raw precious materials. Only confirmation that we have in our documentation is that of the Margaritarius Gaius Atelius Euodus, that use in the patronage the cognomen of his patrons. So it's show is himself like Gaius Atelius Serrani Libertus Euodus. So the use of the cognomen in the patronage reveal that he was a freedman of a member of the Attili Serrani senatorial family. But in all other cases, it's only an hypothesis because the use of the prenomen in the patronage can't
Sorry.
No, don't permit us to go diciamo to
In italiano.
diciamo di avere una certezza in proposito, è solo un'ipotesi di lavoro che si basa su questi presupposti e soprattutto sulla cronologia dei pezzi e sulle attestazioni onomastiche di una famiglia. Per i rubri, ad esempio, i titi rubri a Roma sono veramente pochi al di fuori della famiglia senatoria e quindi potrebbe essere, ma it's only an hypothesis. We haven't any sicurezza, certezza.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to mention an additional aspect. Especially in the 1st century AD, as liberty of senatorial families very often include the cognomen of their patron. And so it's absolutely clear, I am connected to this family, for example, to the Emili Lepidi or the Sulpici Galbae. But in your examples, I have seen not one example with the same denomination. Because it's also for the prestige of the Gemari, if they would include a recognizable family in their tomb inscription, they didn't do it.
So I think that there is also a prejudice of the ruling class toward the manual activity. And so the aristocracy family don't want that our liberty show that they were our liberty, their liberty. It diciamo is possible that is a choice for the manual activity.
But of course, I agree with you. It's very likely that especially such libertine needed first the necessary money to begin the job. And maybe later they tried to avoid to show this connection, show a bit more independence. It's also a hypothesis, of course.
I don't know. I know
Okay.
that.
So,
thank you very much.
So any other questions, please?
Professor Wagner, regarding the non-participating speaker, I think Elisabeth Gagete will make an announcement regarding to this issue. So before we continue, can we give her a chance to speak?
Yeah, of course.
Hello. Maria Elisa Micheli was chased by me, and I found her in a department assembly. She's the head of the department, and she told me that she wrote a message to inform the organizing committee she could not speak today. But I have also two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
The first is for Alfredo Encuentra Ortega. I was really astonished by the slide grouping all the rock crystal vessels in the Museum of Cadiz. And as I never visited it, I wanted to ask you whether they are a grouping for the picture or whether they are objects from the same context.
Hello.
My speaker is no longer here, I'm afraid.
I think so. He should be connected.
I don't see him.
No?
No, he is because he appears in the list of the participants. Anyway, I have another question for Sven Günther. Where is Sven Günther?
Yeah, we are here.
About the passage by Macrobius that you can wear on whichever hand
yes.
finger you want your finger rings. I remember that, for instance, Catullus says finger rings on any finger, but not on the middle finger, which is a digitus vercus, impudicus, and so on. And if I compare this early literary source, Macrobius writes much later, with iconographies, for instance, from funerary stele from northern Italy, I see that actually finger rings on the middle finger are never represented. How can we match these different sources? Is Macrobius referring to a different habit of his times?
Yeah, whether Macrobius is referring to a habit of different times is the one question, but in fact he is quoting a source from the Augustan times. No? And of course, there's always the issue whether this was really said by Gaius Ateius Capito or not. Mm-hmm. This question we cannot answer in the end. But when we look at the structure of this passage and of this whole paragraph, first it's about the discussion of the Egyptian custom, why it ended up on the left hand, on the forefinger, and then comes in fact a kind of, let's say, explanation from the pontifical legal point of view by Gaius Ateius Capito. At least it's framed like this. And then there are several issues linked to this. So the one thing is luxury discourse. So that this hand is more idle. The left one is not used so much, and between the small one and the middle one, the ring is more protected, and especially the precious stone. That's why it ended up there. This is, of course, just an explanation that must be viewed in this kind of luxury discourse. It has nothing to do with actual behavior also. It just wants to tell the old times where there was only one ring and with not really a precious gem, but any kind of sculptura that could seal was a much better time. And nowadays everyone can somehow wear it, and it's on, it's very much decorated. The prices rise, and this fits very well from what we know from Augustan and Tiberian times, what was discussed among the elite, at least, not actually maybe applied to them, but at least in the discourse and in the imagination of them. So I think we cannot use this passage for any kind of reconstruction of actual wearing habits.
Okay. Thank you so much. And compliments on your wonderful presentation.
So, we have time for one last question. Who is ready? If nobody else will anymore ask something, will ich am Ende dann in meiner eigenen Sprache nochmal allen danken, die hier dazu beigetragen haben. Und ich denke, wenn vielleicht diese Texte dann auch publiziert sind mit all den Belegen, dann wird man nochmal dieses alles zusammen sehen können. Und ich glaube, dann ergeben sich noch zusätzliche interessante Aspekte, vor allem für die römische Gesellschaft, worauf ja Sven angespielt hat. Nochmal herzlichen Dank an alle, vor allem auch die Organisatoren des Kongresses, und nun dann für alle einen entsprechenden freie Zeit. Vielen Dank. Auf Wiederhören.